Most people think food got worse because their taste changed. That's not true. Food didn't suddenly turn bad because you got older or fussier. It got worse because the food itself changed, slowly, quietly, and right under everyone's nose. And some of the foods people trust the most today are nothing like what they used to be, even though the packaging still looks familiar. If you've ever picked something up in the supermarket and thought, "I swear this used to be better," you're not imagining it. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that feeling keeps coming back. This video isn't about one brand or one product. It's about how a lot of UK foods that used to be solid, reliable, everyday staples have slowly turned into expensive rubbish without most people noticing when it happened. Not overnight, not all at once, but step by step. And that's the part that matters. Because if food had suddenly gone bad, people would have kicked off. They would have stopped buying it. Brands would have been forced to change. But that didn't happen. Instead, the changes were small enough to ignore, spread out over years, sometimes decades, until one day you realize you're paying more than ever for something that barely resembles what it used to be. That's what we're going to break down today. This isn't about taste tests or personal preferences. It's about history. It's about recipes changing, ingredients being swapped, costs being cut, and prices going up, all while companies leaned hard on nostalgia and brand trust to keep people buying. And it worked, for a long time. To understand how this happened, you have to go back a bit. Not to some fantasy golden age where everything was perfect, but to a time when food was simpler and expectations were different. Go back a few decades. Most people weren't checking ingredient lists. They didn't need to. If something had been around for years and everyone bought it, that was good enough. Brands built their reputations on consistency. If a product tasted good and filled you up, people stayed loyal to it. Supermarkets were smaller, choices were fewer, and food companies didn't have the same pressure they do now to squeeze every last penny out of every product. That doesn't mean everything was healthier or better quality across the board. It just means food was treated more like food and less like a financial tool. Then things started to shift. Big companies bought smaller ones. Family-owned brands were swallowed up by massive groups. Decisions about food stopped being made by people who cooked it and started being made by people who looked at spreadsheets. And when that happens, the questions change. Instead of asking, "How do we make this taste good?" they start asking, "How do we make this cheaper?" Not cheaper for the customer, cheaper to produce. A few pennies saved on each unit doesn't sound like much, but when you're selling millions of units, those pennies turn into serious money. So recipes get tweaked, a real ingredient gets reduced, a cheaper substitute gets added, portions get nudged down slightly. Salt, sugar, and fillers get nudged up because they're cheap and they hide quality loss. And because each change is small, most people don't notice, or if they do notice, they brush it off. This one tin must be a bad batch. Maybe I just didn't heat it properly. Maybe my taste has changed. That doubt works in the company's favor. Another thing that changed is how food is sold. Packaging became more important than what was inside it. Words like classic, traditional, and original started appearing more often, even when the product itself was anything but. The outside stayed familiar, the inside didn't. Prices, meanwhile, kept creeping up, sometimes openly, sometimes through smaller packs at the same price, sometimes by quietly downgrading ingredients while charging premium prices for what used to be standard quality. This is where people really started to feel it, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on why. You're paying more, you're enjoying it less, and somehow you're still being told it's good value. That creates frustration, and you see it everywhere now. People complaining that food is bland, that it's watery, that it doesn't fill them up, that it doesn't taste like it used to, and they're right. And it's not because cooking skills disappeared or because everyone suddenly forgot how food should taste. It's because a lot of products were redesigned to survive in a system that rewards cost-cutting, speed, and shelf life over flavor and substance. The worst part is that many of the foods that declined the most are the ones people trusted the longest, the ones that sat in cupboards for years, the ones you grew up with, the ones you didn't think twice about buying. That trust didn't disappear overnight. It was used. And once a brand knows people will buy out of habit, it gives them room to cut corners without immediate consequences. That's the pattern we're looking at today. In this video, we're going to go through 10 UK foods that used to be genuinely decent, not perfect, not fancy, but good enough that people relied on them, and look at how they ended up where they are now. For each one, we'll talk about what made it popular in the first place, what changed over time, and why people still buy it today even though the value just isn't there anymore. Some of these will probably surprise you, some might annoy you, and at least one of them will almost definitely make you say, "I knew it." Let's start with the first one, and this is where the slow decline really begins. Alright, let's move into food number 10. This one feels almost too obvious now, but that's part of the problem, because for years, nobody questioned it at all. Food number 10, Heinz cream of tomato soup. There was a time when this was the definition of comfort food in the UK. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was just there, in cupboards, in cafes, in hospital trays, at home when you were sick, cold, or skint. You heated it up, added some bread, and it did the job. And for a long time, it actually tasted like tomato soup. If you go back far enough, Heinz tomato soup was simple. Tomatoes, water, a bit of seasoning. It was slightly sweet, slightly sharp, and thick enough to feel like a meal rather than a drink. You didn't analyze it. You trusted it. That trust mattered more than people realize. But this is where the slow change starts. Over time, the recipe didn't change all at once. There was no big announcement, no new and improved moment that made people stop and think. Instead, ingredients were adjusted bit by bit. Tomato content reduced slightly, sugar crept up, thickeners started doing more of the work that real ingredients used to do. The soup became smoother, but also flatter, sweeter, but less tomatoey, thicker, but in a way that felt artificial rather than hearty. And most people didn't notice right away, partly because Heinz kept everything else the same. Same tin, same colors, same branding, same memories attached to it. When something looks identical to what you grew up with, your brain fills in the gaps. You expect it to taste right, so you assume it does. But over the years, something odd happened. People started adding more to it just to make it enjoyable. Extra pepper, a knob of butter, cheese. Bread wasn't optional anymore, it was necessary. That's usually a sign. At the same time, the price kept going up. What used to be a cheap, reliable option slowly drifted into "why is this so expensive?" territory, and yet people kept buying it, because it was Heinz, and Heinz had always been safe. The real issue isn't that Heinz tomato soup is inedible, it's that it no longer earns the loyalty it still trades on. You're paying for the memory of what it used to be, not the reality of what it is now. And when people say, it doesn't taste the same anymore, they're not being dramatic. They're noticing the end result of years of tiny changes that all went in the same direction: cheaper to make, longer to store, more consistent across massive production runs, and less satisfying to eat. This is the pattern you're going to see again and again in this list. A solid product, a trusted name, small changes nobody talks about, and eventually, a version that survives mostly on habit. Heinz tomato soup didn't collapse overnight. It faded, and that fading is exactly why it still sells. Now, if that feels familiar, wait until you see the next one, because this time, it wasn't just the recipe that changed. It was the entire purpose of the product. Food number 9, Kellogg's Corn Flakes. For a long time, corn flakes were the most boring cereal in the best possible way. They weren't pretending to be exciting. They weren't covered in chocolate or packed with gimmicks. They were just simple flakes you could rely on. Parents trusted them, kids ate them without fuss. And for decades, nobody questioned what was in the box. That simplicity was the selling point. Originally, corn flakes were exactly what they sounded like: corn, processed into flakes, lightly toasted, with very little added. They weren't sweet, they weren't flashy. You added sugar yourself if you wanted it. The product didn't push sweetness on you. But over time, that balance shifted. As competition increased and cereal aisles became more crowded, plain stopped being good enough. Health claims started appearing. Reformulations happened quietly. Sugar didn't disappear, it just got disguised. Salt levels crept up. Texture changed. The flakes became thinner, lighter, and quicker to turn soggy. If you've ever poured a bowl and noticed it goes soft almost immediately, that's not your imagination. That's a cost and process change. Then there's the box. Cornflakes boxes used to feel substantial. Now they're taller, thinner, and lighter. You're paying more for a shape that looks full but empties fast. The price has climbed steadily, often justified by branding, advertising, and improved recipes that don't actually improve anything for the person eating it. The real shift, though, is who the product is for. Cornflakes used to be a neutral base. Now they're caught between being marketed as healthy while tasting bland, and being slightly sweet without committing either way. They sit in an awkward middle ground where nobody is fully satisfied. People still buy them because they feel safe, because they've always been there, because it's easier to grab the familiar box than rethink breakfast entirely. But like a lot of foods on this list, cornflakes haven't stayed the same while the world changed around them. They changed too, just quietly enough that most people didn't notice until the bowl was already empty and somehow still disappointing. Food number 8. Bachelor's Cuppa Soup. This one hits a bit differently, because for a lot of people, cup of soup wasn't just food. It was routine. Something you had at work, late at night, or when you didn't have the energy to cook. It felt warm, comforting, and reliable. You added hot water, stirred, and for a few minutes, everything slowed down. And years ago, it actually felt like soup. Early versions of cup of soup weren't amazing, but they had substance. You could see bits of vegetables. The flavor was simple but recognizable. It tasted like a shortcut to something real, not a complete replacement for it. Over time, that changed. The first thing that quietly disappeared was texture. The chunks got smaller. The vegetables became harder to find. What replaced them was powder, more of it. Thickeners took over, creating the illusion of body without actually adding anything filling or satisfying. Then came the flavor shift. Instead of tasting like vegetables, chicken, or tomato, it started tasting like soup flavor, vague, salty, and oddly flat. The kind of taste that doesn't offend, but doesn't comfort either. That's not an accident. Powdered soups are cheap to make, easy to store, and incredibly consistent. You don't need real ingredients when salt, flavorings, and starch can do the heavy lifting. And because cup of soup is sold as a quick fix, people are more forgiving. They don't expect greatness, they just expect it to be fine. But even that bar has dropped. At the same time, the price crept up. What was once a cheap, no-thought option started costing enough that you'd pause, just for a second, before throwing it in the basket. And yet, the quality never followed the price. The biggest reason cup of soup still survives is habit. It lives in office drawers, kitchen cupboards, and memories of breaks and late nights. People don't buy it because it's good, they buy it because it's familiar. And that's the theme again. A product that used to offer simple comfort now offers mostly salt, starch, and nostalgia, sold at a price that suggests it's still something it stopped being a long time ago. Food number 7, bird's eye fish fingers. There was a time when fish fingers felt like a proper meal. Not gourmet, not special, but solid. You put them in the oven, waited, and what came out actually looked like pieces of fish in a crispy coating. You could flake the fish apart and see that it was real, chunky, and filling. For a lot of families, fish fingers were a weekly staple, not a last resort. That's changed. Modern fish fingers are thinner, softer, and somehow less satisfying, even when you eat the same number. The coating feels heavier, while the fish inside feels lighter. That's because the balance has flipped. More crumb, less fish. Over the years, the percentage of actual fish has quietly dropped. It didn't happen in one big cut. It happened in stages. A little less here, a bit more filler there. The coating became a bigger part of the product because breadcrumbs are cheaper than fish and easier to standardize. Texture is where people notice it most. Older fish fingers held together but still flaked naturally. Now they often feel mushy, almost processed, like the fish has been reformed rather than cut. That's not your imagination. That's production efficiency. The price, though, has gone the opposite direction. Fish fingers aren't cheap anymore. What used to be an affordable way to get fish into a family meal now costs enough that you expect quality in return, and you don't get it. Bird's Eye still trades heavily on trust. The name carries weight. The packaging still suggests wholesome, simple food. But inside the box, the product has drifted away from what made people loyal in the first place. People keep buying them because they remember how fish fingers used to be, because kids still like them, because they're easy. But ease has become the main selling point, not quality. Fish fingers didn't need to be fancy, they just needed to stay honest. Instead, they've become another example of a food that slowly gave up substance while asking for more money and hoping nobody would compare it to what came before. Food number 6, Cadbury's dairy milk. This one really divides people, which makes it a perfect example of what we're talking about. Because there are still plenty of people who will say, it tastes fine to me, and that's exactly why the change worked. Cadbury's dairy milk used to be simple and unmistakable. It had a creamy texture, a rich cocoa taste, and it melted properly in your mouth. It didn't need explaining. One square and you knew what it was. But if you've eaten it for decades, you can feel the difference now. The texture is the first giveaway. Modern dairy milk is firmer. It doesn't melt the same way. It breaks differently. That creaminess people remember has been dulled down into something flatter and heavier. That's not nostalgia playing tricks, that's a recipe shift. Over time, the balance of ingredients changed. Cocoa solids were reduced. Milk content was adjusted. Cheaper fats replaced more expensive ones. Each change on its own was small enough to defend, but together they reshaped the chocolate into something that feels more processed and less indulgent. Ownership matters here. When Cadbury became part of a global operation, the chocolate had to work everywhere, not just in the UK. That means consistency, longer shelf life, and lower costs matter more than local taste preferences. And then there's the size issue. Bars have shrunk, multipacks feel lighter, prices have climbed anyway. What used to be a cheap treat now costs enough that you notice, especially when the experience doesn't match the price. People still buy dairy milk because the name is powerful. It's tied to childhood, to gifts, to holidays, to habits. That emotional connection carries it further than quality alone ever could. Cadbury's didn't become bad overnight. It became different, and for a product built entirely on taste and pleasure, different isn't a neutral change. It's a quiet downgrade, one that survives because most people don't want to admit something they loved has moved on without them. Food number 5, McVitie's digestive biscuits. Digestives used to be one of those foods you didn't even think about. They were just there. You had them with tea, dunked them, used them as a base for cheesecakes, or grabbed a couple when you were hungry. They were simple, sturdy, and reliable. Not exciting, but dependable in a way that mattered. And that's exactly why the decline stands out now. Older digestives had weight to them. They snapped cleanly, held together in tea without turning to mush straight away, and had a proper wheaty taste. They weren't sweet biscuits pretending to be healthy. They tasted like something baked, not engineered. Over time, that changed. The texture is the easiest thing to notice. Modern digestives are lighter, more crumbly, and far quicker to fall apart. Dunk one now and you've got seconds before it collapses. That sturdiness people relied on has gone, replaced by a biscuit that feels thinner and less satisfying. Flavor has shifted too. There's more sweetness, less depth. The wheaty, slightly savory edge that balanced the biscuit has been softened. That usually happens when cheaper ingredients are swapped in and recipes are simplified for mass production. Then there's the size. Biscuits are smaller. Packs feel lighter. Yet prices keep rising. What was once a basic, good value biscuit now sits at a price point that doesn't match the experience. Like many brands on this list, McVitie's leans hard on familiarity. The packaging looks almost the same. The name carries trust. Most people don't question it because it feels safe. But digestives weren't meant to be clever or flashy. They just needed to stay solid and honest. Instead, they've drifted into that familiar space where the product still exists, still sells, but no longer lives up to the quiet reliability that made people loyal in the first place. It's not a disaster. It's worse than that. It's a slow letdown, the kind you only notice once you remember how it used to be. Food number 4, Heinz baked beans. This one feels almost untouchable, which is exactly why it belongs here. Heinz baked beans weren't just food. They were a default setting. Beans on toast wasn't a recipe, it was a fact of life. Cheap, filling, reliable, and somehow always satisfying. You didn't think about buying them. You just did. And for a long time, they earned that place. Older tins of baked beans had a thicker sauce, a deeper flavor, and beans that actually held their shape. The balance between tomato, sweetness, and salt felt right. You could eat them on their own and not feel like you were missing something. That balance has shifted. The first thing many people notice now is the sauce. It's thinner, more watery. It spreads across the plate instead of clinging to the beans. That's usually a sign that something has been stretched, more liquid, less substance. The beans themselves feel softer too, almost fragile. They break apart more easily, which changes the whole texture of the meal. Beans on toast used to feel hearty. Now it can feel like toast floating in orange liquid. Once again, this didn't happen overnight. The recipe was adjusted slowly, small changes to sugar, salt, and tomato content. Cost-saving tweaks that most people wouldn't spot in isolation. And then there's the price. Baked beans used to be the definition of cheap food. Now, a single tin can cost enough that people actually hesitate. That's a big psychological shift for a product that built its reputation on value. Heinz still leans heavily on trust. The branding hasn't changed much. The message is still the same great taste. But a lot of people quietly disagree. They just don't always say it out loud. People keep buying Heinz baked beans because they're familiar, because alternatives feel risky, and because it's hard to accept that something so basic could slip this far. But it has. And like everything else on this list, it didn't fall. It drifted. Food number 3, Baxters tinned soups. For a long time, Baxters sat in a different category to most tinned soups. It was the one you bought when you wanted something a bit better. The label felt premium, the flavors sounded grown up, and compared to cheaper options, it actually felt like you were paying for quality. Years ago, that wasn't an illusion. Older Baxters soups had real texture. You could see vegetables. You could taste individual ingredients. The soup felt thick because it was full, not because it had been engineered to seem that way. If you poured it into a bowl, it looked like food, not colored liquid. That reputation carried Baxters a long way, but slowly, the gap between the image and the product started to close, and not in a good way. Recipes were adjusted. Ingredients were reduced. The soups became smoother, more uniform, and less distinctive. Different flavors started to blur into one another. A big giveaway is how similar many Baxter's soups taste now. Creamy ones especially. The base feels the same, with flavor added on top rather than built in. That usually means more reliance on thickeners and flavorings, and less reliance on actual vegetables or stock. Portion value changed too. Tin stayed the same size, but what was inside felt lighter, less filling. Something you could finish and still feel hungry afterwards. The price, though, stayed firmly in premium territory. In some cases, it climbed even higher. Baxter's still asks you to pay more based on a reputation built years ago, not on what's currently in the tin. And people do pay it, because the branding is reassuring. The name suggests tradition, care, and quality. It feels like a safer bet than cheaper soups, even when the difference is no longer clear. Baxter's didn't become terrible. That's not the story. It became ordinary while still charging like it was special. And once that happens, the trust starts to wear thin, even if people can't quite explain why. Food number 2. Kellogg Special K. This one is a perfect example of how food didn't just get worse, it got confused. Special K built its entire reputation on being the sensible choice. It wasn't meant to be fun. It wasn't meant to be indulgent. It was for people who wanted something light, controlled, and supposedly better for them. For years, that image worked. People trusted it without thinking too hard. But over time, the product drifted away from what it claimed to be. Originally, Special K was very plain. Flakes, simple taste, nothing flashy. You knew what you were getting. It wasn't pretending to be a treat. You added fruit or sugar yourself if you wanted more flavor. Then the range exploded. Suddenly there were multiple versions. Added flavors. Added sweetness. Added bits and coatings. What had once been a simple cereal turned into a whole aisle of healthier-looking options that didn't feel very different from regular sweet cereals once you actually ate them. The texture changed too. The flakes became lighter, airier, and quicker to go soggy. That's usually a sign of cost saving and processing changes. Less substance, more volume. At the same time, the marketing leaned harder into health. Words like balance, light, and feel good did more work than the ingredients themselves. The box tells you one story. The bowl tells you another. And then there's the price. Special K costs more than many cereals that are just as filling, sometimes more. You're paying for an idea, not just food. People keep buying it because it feels responsible. It feels like you're making a better choice, even when the product itself has drifted closer to the very things it was meant to stand apart from. Special K didn't suddenly become bad. It slowly stopped being honest about what it was. And once that line blurs, trust becomes a marketing tool rather than something earned. Food number 1. Cadbury's Cream Egg. This one sits at the top because it represents the biggest shift between memory and reality. There was a time when a cream egg felt like an event. You waited for it. You noticed when it came back into shops. It was rich, sweet, messy, and indulgent in a way that felt deliberate. You ate one and that was enough. Older cream eggs were heavier. The chocolate shell had more snap. The filling was thicker, smoother, and tasted properly rich rather than just sweet. It felt like something that hadn't been designed to be eaten in large numbers, and that's exactly why it worked. Now compare that to today. The first thing people notice is the size. Cream eggs are smaller. That's not up for debate. You can see it in your hand. The weight has dropped, but the price hasn't followed it down. In fact, it's gone the other way. Then there's the chocolate. It doesn't melt the same way. It doesn't taste the same. It's waxier, firmer, and less forgiving. That change alone alters the whole experience, because the shell used to be half the appeal. The filling has changed too. It's sweeter, thinner, and less satisfying. The balance is off. What used to feel rich now feels like sugar doing all the work. And yet, the branding is almost identical. Same colors, same name, same seasonal hype. The product relies completely on memory to carry it. This is where the decline becomes impossible to ignore. Because cream eggs aren't everyday food, they're meant to be special. When even that special stuff gets downgraded, it becomes obvious that nothing is off limits. People still buy them out of habit, nostalgia, and curiosity. But more and more, the reaction is the same. that wasn't as good as I remember. And that's the point. The best example of food decline isn't something that became awful, it's something that became disappointing, while pretending nothing had changed at all. At this point, it should be clear that none of this happened by accident. When people talk about food going downhill, it's often framed like a mystery, like nobody knows why it happened. Like it's just one of those things you're supposed to shrug at and accept. But when you line all of these foods up next to each other, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Different products, different categories, different companies, same outcome. That's not coincidence. That's a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The most important thing to understand is that food didn't get worse because companies forgot how to make it good. They didn't suddenly lose the knowledge. The recipes didn't change because someone made a mistake. They changed because the priorities changed. Once food stops being seen mainly as something people eat and starts being seen as something people buy regularly, everything shifts. In the past, quality was how brands competed. If your product tasted better, people came back. If it felt filling, if it worked, if it held up, you earned loyalty. That loyalty mattered because there were fewer options and switching brands meant something. Today, loyalty works differently. Now it's built on habit, packaging, and memory. Once a brand knows people buy it without thinking, it gets breathing room. And in that breathing room, corners get cut. One cheaper ingredient doesn't matter on its own. One smaller portion doesn't cause outrage. One tiny change to texture or flavor is easy to blame on yourself. But stack those changes over years, and you end up with something completely different, still wearing the same name. And that's the key part. The name stays. The look stays. The memory stays. The product doesn't. That's why so many people struggle to explain what's wrong. They just know something is off. They feel it when food doesn't fill them up anymore, when it tastes flat, when it needs fixing, when it costs more but somehow delivers less. This system relies on people doubting their own judgment. If a food suddenly tasted terrible, people would stop buying it. But if it tastes just okay, just acceptable enough, people keep going. They complain quietly. They adjust. They add extras. They accept it. That's where profit lives. Another thing that matters here is scale. Once a product is made for millions instead of thousands, it has to survive transport, storage, and long shelf lives. That encourages recipes that are stable rather than satisfying, uniform rather than rich, predictable rather than good. That's why so many of these foods feel smoother, softer, blander, and sweeter than they used to. Sugar, salt, and fat are cheap. They're reliable. They hide problems. They make lower quality ingredients passable. Real ingredients are unpredictable. They vary. They cost more. They don't behave nicely in massive factories, so they get reduced. And when people say, well, companies have to make money, that's true. But the question isn't whether profit exists. It's how far quality is allowed to fall before the product becomes something else entirely. What makes this worse is how often these changes are wrapped in language that sounds positive. Improved recipe, new taste, same great flavor. Those phrases don't exist to inform you. They exist to stop you from asking questions. And most of the time, they work. Because life is busy, people don't have time to investigate every tin, every packet, every box. They rely on trust, on familiarity, on the idea that something that's been around forever must still be doing something right. That assumption used to be safe. It isn't anymore. What you're really seeing in all of these examples is the slow erosion of standards. Not because people demanded worse food, but because the system learned it could get away with it. Once a brand realizes that the drop in quality doesn't lead to an immediate drop in sales, there's no incentive to reverse it. In fact, there's an incentive to keep going. Cut a bit more. Stretch a bit further. Charge a bit extra. And if sales dip slightly, blame the economy. Blame changing tastes. Blame anything except the product. This is why so many foods now feel like shadows of themselves. Not awful, just underwhelming. Not offensive, just disappointing. Disappointment is quiet, outrage is loud, and quiet is easier to manage. There's also something uncomfortable here that people don't always want to admit. Brands know most customers won't walk away easily. Food isn't like a gadget or a service you cancel. It's routine, it's comfort, it's something you grab when you're tired. That's powerful. If you mess with something people rely on when they're hungry, busy, stressed, or sick, you don't need to make it good. You just need to make it familiar enough. That's why nostalgia is such a strong tool. It bridges the gap between what the product used to be and what it is now. People buy the memory, not the meal. But memories don't feed you, and over time, this creates a strange situation where people are spending more money than ever on food they enjoy less than ever. They feel it, but they don't always know where to place the blame. So they blame themselves. They blame age. They blame changing tastes. Very rarely do they blame the system that quietly rewrote the rules. That's why this moment matters. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you realize that the decline isn't random, it stops feeling personal. You're not picky. You're not imagining it. You're not remembering it wrong. Food really did change, and not because it had to, but because it was allowed to. That's the turning point. Because from here on, you start noticing it everywhere. You read labels differently. You question price rises. You compare how full you feel. You stop assuming that a trusted name automatically means value. That awareness doesn't mean you never buy these foods again. It just means you buy them with open eyes instead of blind trust. And that's exactly what the system hopes you won't do. When you look back over everything we've covered, the most striking thing isn't that these foods became terrible. It's that they became less filling, less satisfying, less honest, while asking for more money and more loyalty than ever before. That's why so many people struggle to explain what feels wrong. If something is outright bad, you reject it. But when something is just a bit worse than it used to be, you adjust. You shrug. You move on. And that's exactly how this decline slipped through unnoticed for so long. None of the foods on this list collapsed overnight. They faded, slowly enough that habits stayed intact. Slowly enough that the brand name still carried weight. Slowly enough that people blamed themselves rather than the product. That's not a failure of consumers. It's a design feature of the system. Food today is built to survive logistics, scale, and profit targets before it's built to satisfy the person eating it. The result isn't starvation or crisis. It's disappointment. It's that feeling of being full but not satisfied, of eating something and wondering why it didn't quite hit the spot. And that feeling shows up again and again. You see it when prices rise but portions shrink, when recipes change but packaging stays the same, when something that used to feel like a treat starts feeling flat. What makes this worse is how heavily companies rely on memory. They know people don't buy food in a vacuum. They buy it attached to childhood, routine, comfort, and trust. Once that trust is established, it can be spent slowly, carefully, without immediate backlash. That's why so many of these products still sell well, not because they're the best option on the shelf, but because they're the easiest one to reach for. And this isn't about telling anyone what they should or shouldn't eat. Everyone has busy days. Everyone relies on convenience sometimes. That's not the issue. The issue is pretending nothing changed, because once you admit that it did, a lot of things start to make sense. Why food doesn't fill you up the way it used to. Why you need to add things to make it enjoyable. Why shopping feels more expensive without feeling more rewarding. You're not imagining it. You're not remembering wrong. You didn't suddenly lose your taste buds. The food changed. And once you see that, you get something important back. Choice. You don't have to reject everything on this list forever, but you can stop buying on autopilot. You can pause when a familiar product costs more than it should. You can question whether the comfort you're paying for is real or just remembered. Even small changes matter. Switching one product, cooking one extra meal from scratch, trying a different brand instead of defaulting to the old one. None of that requires perfection. It just requires awareness. And that awareness is the real takeaway here. Food used to earn trust by being good. Now it often relies on trust because it used to be good. That difference matters. Once you understand that, you stop feeling confused or disappointed in yourself. You start seeing the bigger picture, and you realize that demanding better isn't being picky. It's being reasonable. Because if something is going to trade on decades of loyalty, it should at least try to live up to it. And if you want to keep going, watch the next video.